Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're opening a door into a strange, forgotten archive of human fear. A journey through 20 creatures that once terrified entire civilizations and then quietly vanished from memory. For thousands of years, people believed these beings were real. They shaped prayers, rituals, architecture, even the way people slept at night. In ancient Mesopotamia, the restless dead, called the Giddim, were feared to rise if the living forgot their duties. In Babylon, a demon named Lamashtu haunted the dreams of parents who feared losing their children. In Egypt, a cosmic serpent named Apep was believed to battle the sun every night in a struggle between darkness and order. Medieval Europe imagined plague demons, headless riders announcing death, and creatures that sat silently on your chest while you slept, stealing your breath in the darkness. And centuries later, in the forests and mountains of the New World, people whispered about things that moved just beyond the firelight. A winged devil in the pine barrens, something hiding behind trees in the logging camps, and a distant howl echoing through the Ozark Hills. Tonight, we're not just telling scary stories, we're investigating something far more fascinating. How entire societies create monsters, why millions of people believe in them, and what causes those creatures to disappear from human memory. Because every monster in history tells us something about ourselves, our fears, our grief, our imagination, and the mysterious ways human beings try to understand the unknown. So tonight, as we slowly travel across 4,000 years of folklore, mythology explained, and quiet historical mysteries, this deep dive documentary will gently guide you through ancient temples, medieval villages, Victorian streets, and silent American forests, revealing creatures that once felt terrifyingly real to the people who believed in them. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, take a slow breath, let the noise of the modern world fade away, and allow your mind to wander back through the long, shadowed corridors of history, where forgotten monsters still whisper in the dark, waiting patiently for someone to remember them again. Imagine a world where the dead were never truly gone, where the boundary between the living and the departed was not a wall, but a thin, shifting veil that could ripple at any moment. In the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, between the slow, winding rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, people lived with a quiet awareness that death did not always mean departure. Sometimes it meant return. When historians discuss mythology explained through the lens of ancient civilizations' sleep narratives, Mesopotamia often stands at the beginning of the story, because this was one of the first societies to imagine the dead not as distant spirits, but as neighbors who might still linger nearby. The Sumerians had a name for these restless presences. They called them Giddim. To modern ears, the word may sound like the title of a forgotten monster, but to the people who lived beneath the shadow of the ziggurats, the Giddim were something far more intimate and unsettling. They were not distant demons sent by the gods. They were once human, someone's brother, someone's mother, someone whose body had not been buried properly, whose funeral rites had been neglected, or whose name had simply faded from memory. In the fragile ecosystem of ancient societies, remembrance was not just emotional, it was a sacred duty. When a person died, their family was expected to perform rituals, pour offerings of water and beer, whisper their name into the air so that the spirit could find peace in the underworld known as Kur. But when those rituals failed, when war, famine, or simple forgetfulness interrupted the delicate chain of remembrance, something unsettling was believed to happen. The soul did not vanish. Instead, it remained trapped between worlds, wandering, restless, hungry. That wandering presence was the Gedim. Unlike the ghosts of modern horror stories, a Gedim did not float through corridors or slam doors in dramatic bursts of supernatural energy. Its presence was quiet, patient, almost invisible. Mesopotamian texts describe it not as a sudden terror, but as a slow shadow that attached itself to the living. Imagine sitting down to eat your evening meal while the desert wind hums softly outside your clay home, and somewhere behind you, unseen but deeply felt, a forgotten ancestor waits, not with rage, but with need. A Gedim followed people through their daily routines. It stood beside them while they worked in the fields. It lingered near their beds at night. It whispered into the fragile border between waking and sleep. And gradually, over time, the living body began to weaken. Fevers arrived, joints stiffened, dreams grew restless. In our modern world, we would call these symptoms illness, but in the worldview of Mesopotamian mythology, illness was rarely random. It was communication, a message from the unseen world. The Gedim was not merely haunting you, it was reminding you that something had been forgotten, something sacred had been neglected. This belief system created a powerful emotional structure inside early civilizations. It meant that suffering always had a narrative. A fever was not just fever, it was a story waiting to be understood. When someone fell ill, families did not rush to physicians the way we do today. Instead, they sought priests, ritual specialists who understood the delicate language of spirits and ancestors. These priests would perform incantations, offer food and water to the wandering dead, and attempt to restore the balance between worlds. In the quiet rhythm of bedtime history storytelling, it is easy to see how this belief might have comforted people living in a harsh and unpredictable landscape. Life along the rivers could be generous one season and brutal the next. Floods, droughts, disease, and war could take loved ones suddenly and without explanation. The idea that the dead still lingered nearby meant that relationships did not end at the grave, they simply changed form. But as centuries passed, something else began to change as well. New religious ideas slowly reshaped the mental landscape of the ancient world. Monotheistic traditions introduced a simpler structure for the afterlife, a clear destination where souls traveled once their earthly lives were finished. Heaven or hell, judgment or salvation. Within these systems, there was little room for wandering ancestors who drifted invisibly through the lives of the living. And so, the Gedim gradually faded, not because people stopped fearing the unknown, but because the framework that gave the creature meaning quietly dissolved. Today, the Gedim survives only in fragments of clay tablets and scholarly translations, a faint echo of a time when humanity believed that forgetting the dead might allow them to return. In the soft darkness of a bedtime history journey, it is worth pausing for a moment to consider that ancient fear. Not the fear of monsters, but the fear of being forgotten. For the people of Mesopotamia, memory itself was a kind of protection. And perhaps, even now, somewhere deep in the quiet layers of human mythology, that instinct still whispers that remembrance keeps the world in balance. So, if the Gedim represented something personal, something quietly haunting the relationship between the living and the forgotten dead, the next creature emerging from the mythology of Mesopotamia carried a far more primal terror. One that echoes through every civilization and every era of human history. It was the fear that every parent understands instinctively, even before language forms the thought. The fear of losing a child. In the warm dust of ancient Babylonian cities, where mud brick homes stood beneath the blazing sun and the Euphrates flowed slowly past the walls, parents lived with a reality that modern societies rarely face with the same intensity. Childhood was fragile, life was uncertain. Fevers arrived without warning, infections spread silently. In some communities, historians estimate that nearly 1 out of every 3 children did not survive beyond the early years of life. For a civilization trying to understand the world through mythology explained by priests, rituals, and sacred stories, such loss demanded an explanation. And so, from the depths of that collective grief, a terrifying figure emerged. Her name was Lamashtu. Unlike most demons in Mesopotamian mythology, Lamashtu was not a servant of the gods. Most demons were described as agents, tools sent by divine powers to punish wrongdoing or restore cosmic balance. But Lamashtu answered to no one. She was wild, independent, ancient. Texts describe her appearance in disturbing detail, as if the storytellers themselves were trying to capture something truly unnatural. She had the head of a lion, with eyes that burned like desert fire. Her teeth were long and crooked like those of a donkey. Her hands ended in talons sharp enough to tear through flesh. At her breasts she nursed 2 strange creatures, a pig and a jackal, twisted symbols of motherhood turned inside out. And while many demons attacked warriors, kings, or travelers, Lamashtu had a far more intimate target. She hunted infants. The stories told of her slipping silently into homes at night, moving through doorways like a shadow carried by the wind. She would approach the cradle where a sleeping child lay, reach down with clawed hands, and steal the infant away. Sometimes the stories said she drank the child's blood. Other times they said she carried the child into the wilderness where no one could follow. To modern listeners, these descriptions may sound like the exaggerations of ancient horror stories, but within the quiet rhythm of bedtime history, they reveal something far more human. They reveal grief trying to make sense of loss. Imagine living in a world where medicine does not exist in any meaningful form, where a child can fall asleep healthy and wake with a fever that no one understands. Imagine holding a child who grows weaker by the hour, while the adults around you whisper prayers and burn incense, hoping that something unseen might change the outcome. When the child finally stops breathing, the silence left behind is unbearable. In that silence, the human mind begins searching for meaning. Why this child? Why this family? Why tonight? Lamashtu provided an answer. A terrible answer, but an answer nonetheless. The child was not taken randomly. A demon chose them. Something powerful reached into the home and carried them away. And if the cause was supernatural, then perhaps the defense could be supernatural as well. This is where the story becomes unexpectedly touching, even beautiful in its own quiet way. Babylonian parents did not simply accept Lamashtu's power. They fought back. Archaeologists have discovered countless small amulets carved from stone or clay, worn around the necks of mothers or placed beside the beds of infants. These amulets often depicted another figure from Mesopotamian mythology, the demon Pazuzu, who despite his terrifying appearance was believed to protect children by driving Lamashtu away. In some homes, clay figurines were placed near the doorways, decoys, symbolic children meant to distract the demon and lure her away from the real infant sleeping inside. Priests recited incantations through the night, whispering ancient words meant to bind the demon and force her back into the wilderness. Through these rituals, grieving families were given something incredibly powerful. Not certainty, not control, but resistance. In the world of ancient civilization's sleep storytelling, that resistance mattered deeply. It transformed helpless sorrow into action. Parents could not cure the illness that took their children, but they could light lamps, hang protective charms and believe that they were fighting for the life of the child they loved. And perhaps that belief alone made the darkness easier to endure. Over time, as centuries passed and the world slowly changed, the power of Lamashtu began to fade. Not because people stopped fearing for their children, but because a different explanation slowly replaced the old one. As medicine developed and knowledge about disease expanded, infant mortality began to decline. Fevers that once seemed mysterious gradually became understandable. Infections that once appeared supernatural gained scientific explanations. The demon who once haunted the cradle quietly retreated into the pages of mythology. Today, Lamashtu survives only as a carved image on ancient amulets and fragments of clay tablets resting in museum collections. Yet the emotions that created her have not disappeared. Even now, in the quiet moments when parents watch their children sleep, there remains a faint echo of that ancient instinct to protect them from unseen dangers in the dark. And perhaps, somewhere deep within the human imagination, the shadow of Lamashtu still lingers as a reminder of a time when mythology and survival were woven together in the fragile cradle of civilization. As the lamps of Babylon dimmed and the wind carried the distant sound of river water through the narrow streets, people of the ancient world understood something unsettling about illness. It could appear without warning. A man could wake strong and healthy, walk into the fields beneath the hot Mesopotamian sun, and by evening feel a strange heaviness spreading through his body. His breath would shorten, his limbs would tremble. By the following morning, fever might burn through him like desert fire. In the quiet rhythm of bedtime history, this fragile unpredictability reminds us how terrifying disease once felt in a world without medicine, microscopes, or the invisible language of bacteria and viruses. For the civilizations that lived along the rivers of Mesopotamia, illness needed an explanation, just as grief had needed one in the story of Lamashtu. But the cause of sickness was not always the anger of a forgotten ancestor or the cruelty of a child-stealing demon. Sometimes the threat was more subtle, more insidious. The ancient texts describe a presence known as the Akazu. In Mesopotamian mythology, the Akazu was not a single creature, but a category of spirits associated with wasting disease and slow deterioration. Its name appears in clay tablets describing curses, sickness rituals, and incantations designed to drive illness away. When modern scholars explore mythology explained through ancient civilization sleep narratives, the Akazu stands as one of the earliest attempts humanity made to conceptualize epidemic disease. Unlike the dramatic monsters of later folklore, the Akazu had almost no clear physical description. It was not defined by claws or horns or terrifying wings. Instead, it existed as something more unsettling, a presence that entered quietly, a force that consumed the body from within. Imagine the people of ancient Mesopotamia observing symptoms they could not understand: a persistent cough, skin growing pale, energy draining day by day. These slow illnesses must have seemed almost supernatural, as if some unseen parasite of the spirit world had attached itself to the human body. The Akazu represented that invisible predator. In mythology texts, it was described as feeding on human vitality, drinking strength from the bones and breath from the lungs. Some accounts suggested it crawled through the air like a shadow. Others claimed it entered the body through the mouth while a person slept, sliding silently into the chest where it would remain hidden while the victim weakened. For listeners following this bedtime history journey, the symbolism is striking. Long before science discovered pathogens, ancient cultures were already imagining disease as an unseen invader. The Akazu functioned as a narrative tool that allowed people to describe something they could feel but not see. If someone grew ill, the explanation was simple. A demon had entered them, and once the cause had a name, it could be confronted.
Mesopotamian healers, who existed somewhere between priests and early physicians, developed elaborate rituals intended to remove these spirits from the body. Clay bowls were inscribed with protective spells and buried beneath the floors of houses. Amulets were worn around the neck to block the demon's entry. Incantations were whispered beside the sickbed, describing the demon being seized, bound, and driven out into the wilderness beyond the city walls. These practices may sound primitive from a modern perspective, but they reveal something deeply human about early mythology. When people cannot control a threat, they create stories that allow them to fight it symbolically. In the darkness of ancient nights, when families gathered around dim oil lamps while someone they loved struggled to breathe, the belief that a ritual could push the demon away offered a fragile but meaningful hope. The Akazu therefore became not only a monster of sickness, but also a psychological framework that gave suffering structure. In the broader arc of mythology and bedtime history, this pattern appears again and again across cultures. Invisible dangers are transformed into beings that can be named, confronted, and expelled. But like the Gadim and Lamashtu before it, the Akazu eventually faded from the collective imagination. The disappearance did not occur suddenly. Instead, it unfolded slowly as human understanding of disease began to change. Over centuries, early medical traditions in Greece, Persia, and later the Islamic world began describing illness through observation and natural causes rather than spirits. Fevers were studied, herbs were tested, physicians recorded symptoms and treatments in written texts. As these systems of knowledge expanded, the need for a disease demon gradually diminished. The Akazu was not defeated in battle, it simply became unnecessary. Today, we know that the slow illnesses once attributed to demons were likely infections, parasites, or chronic diseases that ancient people could not yet explain. Yet the story of the Akazu still carries a quiet resonance. It reminds us that even the most advanced scientific understanding grows from earlier attempts to interpret the unknown. In the deep past, mythology was humanity's first language for describing the invisible forces shaping life and death. And so, somewhere in the long twilight between myth and science, the Akazu slipped quietly out of the human story, leaving behind only fragments of clay tablets and a haunting reminder of how frightening the unseen world once felt to the first civilizations beneath the stars.
From the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, where sickness was once imagined as a wandering demon, our journey drifts slowly southwest along ancient trade routes toward another great cradle of civilization. Here, the landscape changes, the rivers widen, the air grows warm and humid. Tall reeds sway along the edges of dark water, while temples carved from pale stone rise beneath an endless sky. We have arrived in ancient Egypt, a world where the rhythm of life was measured by the Nile's floods and the rising of the sun each morning. For the Egyptians, the sunrise was not merely a predictable astronomical event, it was proof that the universe had survived another night. In many modern bedtime history explorations, scholars often pause here because Egyptian mythology presents one of the most dramatic cosmic struggles ever imagined by human civilization. Every evening, when the glowing disk of the sun touched the western horizon and slipped beneath the desert hills, Egyptians believed something extraordinary was happening beyond human sight. The sun god Ra was not disappearing, he was beginning a journey. Each night, Ra boarded a divine boat known as the Solar Bark, a sacred vessel that carried him through the underworld during 12 dangerous hours of darkness. This voyage was not peaceful. Waiting in the depths of that unseen realm was a creature older than gods and kings alike, a being that represented chaos itself. Its name was Apep. In Egyptian mythology, explained through temple inscriptions and funerary texts, Apep was described as a serpent so vast that it could coil across the entire sky. Some stories imagined its body stretching miles through the underworld like a living mountain of shadow.
Its scales were black as the deepest night, and its eyes burned with a cold hatred for order, light, and existence itself. Unlike many mythological monsters that appear only occasionally, Apep attacked every single night. As Ra's solar boat sailed through the darkness, the serpent would rise from the void and attempt to swallow the sun. If Apep succeeded, the Egyptians believed the result would not simply be a long night, it would be the end of everything. The world would collapse into eternal chaos, time itself would unravel. Yet each night, the same story unfolded. Ra did not face the serpent alone. He was accompanied by a crew of gods and divine guardians who defended the boat during its perilous journey. They fought with spears of light, magical incantations, and cosmic weapons described in temple texts carved thousands of years ago. Sometimes the serpent wrapped its enormous body around the solar boat, trying to crush it within its coils. Other times, it opened its vast jaws in an attempt to devour the sun itself. But somehow, again and again, the gods managed to defeat it. And when dawn finally broke across the eastern horizon, Egyptians saw the rising sun not as routine, but as victory. The battle had been won once more. What makes this belief particularly powerful in the context of ancient civilizations' sleep storytelling is that Egyptians did not imagine themselves as passive observers of this cosmic struggle. They believed they played a role in the outcome. Every night, priests in temples across Egypt performed rituals designed to weaken Apep and strengthen Ra. Sacred texts were recited, effigies of the serpent were burned or stabbed with ritual knives. Ordinary people whispered prayers before sleep, believing their voices joined the divine struggle happening beyond the visible world. In a time before electric light, when darkness truly swallowed the land after sunset, this belief gave meaning to the long hours of night. Imagine standing beside the Nile thousands of years ago while the sky becomes completely black and the stars blaze overhead with an intensity modern cities rarely see. In that silence, the thought that the sun might not return must have felt very real. And so every dawn carried a quiet wave of relief. The universe was still intact. The serpent had failed. Yet, like many creatures we explore in mythology, Apep eventually faded from the human imagination, not because the image of a cosmic serpent stopped being powerful, but because the framework that sustained it slowly changed. Egypt experienced waves of cultural transformation as Greek rulers arrived, followed by Roman influence, and later the spread of Christianity and Islam. Over centuries, the cosmic narrative of Ra's nightly voyage was replaced by new theological and scientific explanations. The rising of the sun became an astronomical certainty rather than a divine victory. The serpent that once threatened the cosmos became a myth preserved in temple walls and fragments of papyrus. Still, there is something deeply poetic about the story of Apep. Even in a modern world filled with scientific knowledge, the metaphor remains quietly resonant. Every night we fall into darkness, uncertain of the next day, and every morning the light returns. In the ancient imagination, that return was not guaranteed, it was earned through struggle. Perhaps that is why, in the soft cadence of bedtime history, the image of a sun battling its way through darkness still feels strangely comforting. It reminds us that even the most powerful forces in the universe must fight their way back into the light.
As our quiet journey through the earliest civilizations continues, the world slowly changes again. The temples of Egypt fade into memory, the desert winds soften, and the great currents of history begin to flow toward another rising power of the ancient world, Rome. By the time the Roman Republic expanded across the Mediterranean, absorbing cultures, myths, and beliefs from Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, the human imagination had already produced thousands of stories explaining the fears that lived in darkness. Yet Rome added its own unsettling creature to the long tradition of mythology explained through bedtime history. Unlike the cosmic serpent Apep or the disease spirits of Mesopotamia, the Roman monster we encounter next was smaller, quieter, and perhaps even more disturbing because of how ordinary it appeared. It was called the Strix. In Latin texts, the word strix referred to a night bird, something similar to an owl, but the creature described in Roman mythology was far from harmless. The Strix was believed to be a predatory spirit that took the form of a dark bird with piercing eyes and sharp hooked claws. It flew silently through the night skies above Roman villages, searching for its favorite prey, sleeping children. The Roman poet Ovid described the Strix in chilling detail nearly 2,000 years ago, explaining that these birds were drawn to the soft breath of infants and the warmth of newborn blood. According to the stories, a Strix would glide down from the darkness and slip through the open windows of Roman homes, its wings barely making a sound as it entered the quiet room where a child slept. There it would perch beside the cradle, lean down with its curved beak, and begin to feed. Some versions of the myth said the creature drank blood. Others claimed it consumed the vital essence of the child, leaving behind weakness, sickness, or death by morning. To modern listeners, the image may sound grotesque, but when viewed through the lens of ancient civilizations' sleep narratives, the Strix reveals a familiar pattern in human storytelling. Like Lamashtu in Babylon, the creature emerged from a very real fear surrounding the vulnerability of children. In ancient Rome, as in most early societies, infant mortality remained painfully common. Families often lost children to fevers, infections, or unexplained illnesses that struck during the night. Without scientific explanations, these tragedies demanded meaning. The Strix offered one. It transformed the invisible threat into a visible predator, something that could be imagined, named, and possibly prevented. Roman households developed protective rituals, remarkably similar to those seen in earlier civilizations. Amulets were hung near cradles. Protective charms were carved with sacred symbols. Mothers whispered prayers to household gods, asking them to guard the child during the night. In some traditions, branches of certain trees were placed near the door or window because they were believed to repel the night bird. These small actions created the illusion of control in a world where parents often felt powerless against illness. Within the broader structure of mythology, creatures like the Strix served an emotional purpose far beyond simple storytelling. They gave shape to anxieties that were otherwise impossible to grasp. In the darkness of ancient nights, when the streets of Rome grew silent and oil lamps flickered inside stone houses, the thought that something unseen might slip through the window must have felt deeply real. But like the monsters we have encountered throughout this chapter, the Strix eventually faded from the center of human belief. As medical knowledge expanded and understanding of disease slowly improved, the invisible predator that haunted Roman cradles gradually retreated into literature and folklore. Interestingly, the legacy of the Strix did not disappear completely. The Latin word itself eventually evolved into the Italian word strega, meaning witch, and many historians believe it helped inspire later European legends about nocturnal witches and vampire-like creatures. In this way, the Strix did not truly die. It simply transformed, passing its shadow forward into the darker folklore of medieval Europe. And so, as we reach the closing moments of this first chapter in our bedtime history exploration of ancient mythology, we are left with a quiet realization. The monsters of early civilization were never random creations. Each one emerged from a specific fear, a specific grief, or a specific mystery that human beings struggled to understand. The Gidam gave form to forgotten ancestors. Lamashtu gave shape to the grief of lost children. The Akazu embodied the invisible terror of disease. Apep represented the cosmic fear that the sun might never rise again.
and the Strix whispered of dangers hiding in the darkness of the night. Together, they form a map of humanity's earliest anxieties, written not in science, but in myth. And as we allow these ancient stories to settle into the quiet rhythm of sleep, our journey now moves forward through time, because the fears of humanity did not disappear with the fall of ancient empires. They evolved, they changed shape, and in the long centuries that followed, the monsters waiting in the darkness would become even stranger.
The medieval world, where the dead chewed through their shrouds, headless riders whispered names into the night, and entire villages listened nervously to the wind as if it carried secrets from the grave. If the ancient civilizations we explored earlier created monsters to explain the mysteries of illness and the movements of the cosmos, the creatures of the Dark Ages emerged from something even more immediate and terrifying. They were born from catastrophe. In 14th century Europe, catastrophe had a name that spread across the continent like a shadow that would not lift: the Black Death. When historians speak about the period in the quiet tone of boring history for sleep, the numbers often sound abstract, but to the people who lived through it, the experience was deeply personal. Entire streets could fall silent within weeks. Families watched one member grow ill, then another, until the household itself seemed cursed. In certain German villages, observers noticed something unsettling about how death seemed to move through families. The dying did not appear random. Instead, it unfolded in a slow sequence, almost as if something beneath the earth were pulling people downward one by one. The villagers gave that invisible force a name drawn from their folklore. They called it the Nachtzehrer. The word roughly translates to after-devourer, and the concept behind it was both strange and haunting. According to medieval belief, the Nachtzehrer did not leave its grave like the vampires of later legend. It never stalked the living under moonlight. Instead, the horror happened inside the coffin itself. The corpse lay underground, wrapped tightly in its burial cloth, and slowly, patiently, it began to chew. It chewed the linen shroud around its face. It chewed its own fingers. Some accounts even claimed it gnawed at its own flesh. Each bite taken in the darkness of the grave was believed to drain life from someone still living above ground, usually a relative, a spouse, a child. In the language of medieval stories for sleep, the connection felt almost biological, as if an invisible cord still linked the dead body to the family it had left behind. With every silent bite beneath the soil, someone in the household grew weaker. Fevers worsened, breath shortened, strength faded, and eventually another coffin would be lowered into the earth. What made the legend of the Nachtzehrer especially convincing to the medieval mind was the disturbing evidence sometimes found when graves were opened. During plague outbreaks, desperate villagers occasionally exhumed bodies suspected of causing continued deaths. When they lifted the lid of the coffin, they sometimes discovered the burial cloth twisted or torn around the corpse's mouth. Dark fluid stained the fabric. The mouth itself appeared slightly open, the lips pulled back in what looked eerily like the aftermath of chewing. To modern forensic science, the explanation is simple. As bodies decompose, gases build up within the chest cavity and push fluid outward through the mouth. That fluid can soak burial cloth and shift fabric into unnatural positions. But to a terrified medieval village, watching its loved ones die in sequence, the scene seemed like undeniable proof. The dead were feeding on the living. What followed reveals something deeply human about how people respond to crisis. If the Nachtzehrer was causing death, then perhaps the creature could be stopped. Villagers developed methods intended to break the invisible connection between corpse and family. Coins were placed inside the mouth of the dead so that the body would chew metal instead of cloth. Bricks were forced between the teeth. In some extreme cases, the corpse was decapitated before burial, or its mouth sewn shut with thread. To
To modernize, these practices may appear brutal, even disturbing, yet within the context of medieval folklore, they represent something profoundly understandable. When disease strikes again and again, and you have no knowledge of bacteria, no concept of contagion, and no medicine to offer the dying, the human mind searches desperately for a cause that can be confronted. The Nachtzerer gave grieving families something tangible to fight. It transformed an invisible plague into a creature with rules, weaknesses, and possible solutions. In that sense, the legend was not merely superstition, it was a psychological survival strategy during one of the darkest pandemics in human history. Over time, as medical understanding slowly expanded and societies began to recognize that disease spread through contact rather than supernatural feeding, belief in the Nachtzerer gradually faded. The creature did not vanish overnight. It lingered in rural folklore for centuries, whispered about in quiet villages where old fears often survive longer than scientific explanations. But eventually, the shroud-chewing revenant slipped into the margins of history, joining the long list of forgotten monsters created by humanity's struggle to understand suffering. And yet, when we listen closely to the old stories of medieval Europe in the calm rhythm of bedtime storytelling, the Nachtzerer still speaks to something deeply familiar. It reminds us that behind every legend of the undead lies a very real human experience: grief searching for meaning, fear searching for control, and communities doing whatever they could to survive a world that suddenly felt far more fragile than they had ever imagined.
From the plague-stricken villages of Germany, where fear of the dead gnawing beneath the earth haunted grieving families, our journey moves westward across the restless waters of the Irish Sea. The air grows colder here, the wind sharper, and the landscape begins to shift into something ancient and mysterious. Rolling green hills stretch beneath low gray clouds, narrow dirt roads wind between stone cottages, and beyond the fields stand forests older than memory itself. It is here, in the folklore of medieval Ireland, that another creature emerged to explain a different kind of fear. Unlike the Nachtzerer, which represented the slow spread of plague through families, this next figure did not hide quietly beneath the ground. It announced itself, loudly, inevitably. The Irish called it the Dullahan. In the calm cadence of boring history for sleep, the Dullahan is often described as one of the most haunting figures in European folklore because of the strange dignity with which it approached death. The creature rode through the countryside at midnight upon a powerful black horse, its hooves striking the earth with a hollow echo that villagers believed could be heard long before the rider appeared. Yet the most unsettling feature of the Dullahan was not the horse, nor the darkness surrounding it. It was the rider itself. The Dullahan carried its own severed head tucked beneath one arm. The head was said to have dark, lifeless eyes that could see across impossible distances, even through thick fog and total darkness. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that reached nearly from ear to ear, revealing teeth pale as bone. In its other hand, the rider held a whip, though this was no ordinary whip. According to Irish stories for sleep passed down through generations, it was fashioned from a human spine. The purpose of the Dullahan was not random violence. It had a task. The rider traveled through the night directly to the home of a person whose life was about to end. When it reached the destination, the horse would stop abruptly outside the door. The Dullahan would lift its severed head high into the air and speak a single name, the name of the person who was about to die. And once the name was spoken, the story said, death would follow immediately. What makes this legend particularly fascinating when examined through the lens of folklore is the absolute certainty surrounding the rider's arrival. Unlike many monsters that could be fought, escaped, or tricked, the Dullahan could not be stopped. No prayer could drive it away,
No locked door could block its path. It was said that every barrier would open for it, even gates that were bolted shut. The only possible way to delay the rider, even briefly, involved something surprisingly simple: gold. In Irish tradition, even a small piece of gold thrown before the Dullahan could force it to retreat temporarily, as if the ancient rider possessed an aversion to the metal. For medieval listeners, this curious detail carried a deeper symbolic meaning. In a society where most rural families possessed very little wealth, the idea that gold could hold back death, even for a moment, mirrored an uncomfortable truth about human existence. Resources often determined survival. Those with wealth had greater access to protection, food, and care. Those without it faced harsher odds. In this sense, the Dullahan was not merely a monster, but a reflection of social reality expressed through mythology. Yet, the creature served another psychological purpose as well. Death in medieval Ireland could arrive suddenly and without explanation. Farming accidents, disease, childbirth complications, or harsh weather could claim a life in an instant. The Dullahan gave those unpredictable deaths a narrative structure. If someone died unexpectedly, it meant the rider had come. The person had been chosen. Their death was not meaningless. It was an event significant enough to summon a supernatural herald from the night. Over the centuries, as Ireland changed and scientific explanations replaced many supernatural beliefs, the Dullahan slowly faded into legend. But unlike some creatures that disappeared entirely, the image of the headless rider continued to echo through later folklore and literature. Many historians believe the Dullahan even influenced the famous tale of the Headless Horseman in later European storytelling. Yet if you travel through rural Ireland today, along narrow roads bordered by ancient hedges and stone walls, it is easy to understand how such a legend once felt real. On nights when the fog rolls across the hills and the wind moves through the trees like distant footsteps, one might almost imagine hearing the slow approach of hooves in the darkness. And somewhere in the quiet imagination of the human mind, the ancient rider still carries its silent message through the sleeping countryside.
From the misty roads of Ireland, where the headless rider called names into the darkness, our journey now drifts eastward again, across the cold waters of the Irish Sea to the quiet countryside of medieval England. Here, the landscape becomes softer, yet somehow no less mysterious. Rolling fields stretch across the horizon, hedgerows divide the land into small farms, and ancient oak forests stand like silent witnesses to centuries of human stories. In these forests, where shadows linger long after sunset, English folklore preserved the memory of a creature that terrified children and unsettled adults alike. Her name was Black Annis. In the slow rhythm of boring history for sleep, Black Annis appears less like a supernatural demon and more like something that emerged from the uneasy imagination of medieval communities living on the edge of deep woodland. According to stories passed down through generations, Black Annis lived inside a hollow tree or a cave carved into a hillside. The most famous location associated with her legend was Dane Hills near Leicester, where locals believed the hag had scratched her dwelling directly into the rock with her iron claws. These claws were often described as impossibly long, curved like hooks, and strong enough to tear through flesh or wood with equal ease. But the feature that made Black Annis especially frightening was her face. Folklore described it as blue or blackened, with sunken eyes that gleamed in the darkness and a mouth full of sharp yellow teeth. Her hair hung wild and tangled around her shoulders like dark vines, and when she moved through the forest, she was said to make almost no sound at all. For medieval villagers living in small communities surrounded by wilderness, the idea of a creature lurking in nearby woods was deeply unsettling. In stories for sleep told to children during long winter nights, Black Annis was said to creep out of her cave after sunset and wander through the countryside searching for prey. And her prey was not livestock, nor travelers on the road. It was children.
According to the legend, Black Annis would snatch children who wandered too far from home, carry them back to her cave, and devour them in the darkness. Some stories even claim she wore their skins like clothing or hung them from the branches of trees to dry in the wind. To modern listeners, these details may sound grotesque, but within the context of medieval folklore, they served a very practical purpose. In rural England, forests were dangerous places for children to wander alone. Wolves still roamed parts of the countryside. Deep wells and ravines could hide beneath dense brush, and getting lost after dark could quickly become fatal. The story of Black Annis acted as a warning disguised as a monster. Parents did not simply tell children that the forest was unsafe, they gave the danger a face, a name, a story vivid enough to be remembered. The legend also reveals something about how medieval societies processed social fears. Some historians believe Black Annis may have originated from distorted memories of real individuals who lived outside the accepted structure of village life. In times of hardship, women who lived alone, practiced herbal medicine, or behaved in ways that unsettled their neighbors were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Over generations, those suspicions could evolve into darker stories, transforming a human outsider into a supernatural threat within the landscape of folklore. Yet even beyond its possible historical origins, the figure of Black Annis played a role in shaping communal boundaries. The forest represented the unknown world beyond the safety of the village, and the hag in the cave embodied that uncertainty. In bedtime storytelling traditions, monsters often guard the edges of civilization. They live just beyond the firelight, reminding people where safety ends and danger begins. Over the centuries, as England became more populated and forests were gradually cleared for farmland and towns, the legend of Black Annis slowly faded. The wild spaces that once fueled the imagination grew smaller, and the dangers they represented became less immediate. Today, the story survives mostly as a curious fragment of British folklore, remembered by historians and storytellers who study how medieval communities interpreted the world around them. Yet there is something strangely enduring about the image of the old hag watching from the darkness of the woods. Even now, when modern roads cut through landscapes that once felt untamed, the human mind still reacts instinctively to deep forest shadows. And perhaps that is why stories like Black Annis remain quietly powerful. They remind us that before cities, before science, before electric lights pushed back the night, the boundary between the village and the wilderness was thin. And just beyond that boundary, imagination could place anything.
From the forests of England, where the shadow of Black Annis once haunted the imagination of children, our journey now returns eastward into the dense woodlands and winding roads of medieval Germany. The forests here were darker, thicker, and in many places nearly impenetrable, stretching across hills and valleys where narrow paths served as the only connection between scattered villages. These were the roads traveled by merchants carrying goods between towns, by farmers returning home after long days in the fields, and by travelers who often found themselves alone beneath the towering canopy of ancient trees. In the quiet storytelling traditions preserved in folklore and repeated in many forms of boring history for sleep, it was along these lonely roads that people believed a strange and unsettling creature waited. It was called the Aufhaker. The name itself comes from Old German words meaning one who jumps upon, and that description tells us almost everything we need to know about its method. Unlike many creatures of medieval mythology, the Aufhaker was not a monster that attacked openly or lurked dramatically in the darkness. Instead, it relied on surprise and exhaustion. According to stories for sleep told in villages across Germany, the Aufhaker would hide near roads and forest paths, waiting patiently for a lone traveler to pass beneath its unseen gaze. The moment the traveler walked beneath the right tree or along the right stretch of path, the creature would suddenly leap from above and land squarely on the person's back. At first, the weight might feel manageable, like carrying a heavy sack of grain.
But the longer the journey continued, the heavier the creature became. With each step, the burden grew greater. Legs weakened, breath shortened. The travelers struggled forward, feeling as though the entire forest pressed down upon their shoulders. Some stories claimed that the Aufhaker laughed quietly as its victims staggered along the road, unable to escape the crushing load. Others said the creature whispered in the traveler's ear, urging them onward even as their strength failed. In many versions of the legend, the victim eventually collapsed beneath the unbearable weight and died alone on the road, while the creature slipped away into the darkness to wait for another passerby. What makes the Aufhaker particularly fascinating when examined through the lens of folklore is how closely it mirrors real experiences travelers might have faced in medieval Europe. Roads were often long, dangerous, and poorly maintained. People frequently traveled on foot for hours or even days, carrying heavy goods across uneven terrain. Fatigue, dehydration, illness, or sudden injury could cause someone to collapse unexpectedly. In a world without medical knowledge or emergency help, such deaths could seem mysterious and inexplicable. The Aufhaker offered a story that made sense of these tragedies. If someone was found dead along a forest path, the explanation was simple. The burden demon had jumped upon them. The legend also reflects a psychological truth about exhaustion that many people still recognize today. Anyone who has carried a heavy load over a long distance knows the strange sensation of weight increasing with every step, even when the object itself has not changed. Muscles burn, breath grows shallow, and the body begins to feel as though something invisible is pressing down upon it. Medieval storytellers transformed that sensation into a creature. Instead of fatigue, it was a demon riding your back. Within the structure of bedtime storytelling and ancient folklore, the Aufhaker therefore becomes more than a simple monster. It represents the unseen burdens that accompany human journeys. Long roads, hard labor, and the quiet struggle to keep moving forward even when strength begins to fade. Over time, as roads improved, travel became safer, and scientific understanding expanded, belief in the Aufhaker gradually faded from everyday life. Yet the image of a hidden weight clinging to a traveler's back remains strangely powerful. Even in modern language, we still speak of carrying burdens, of feeling weighed down by unseen pressures. In that sense, the Aufhaker never fully disappeared. It simply transformed into metaphor. And perhaps that is why when we imagine walking alone along a forest road late at night, there remains a faint instinct to glance over our shoulder, as if checking that nothing unseen has climbed quietly onto our back.
From the shadowed forest roads of Germany, where travelers once feared the crushing weight of the Aufhaker, our journey now continues northward across cold, gray seas toward a cluster of wind-swept islands on the edge of the North Atlantic. These are the Orkney Islands of Scotland, a place where the sea has always shaped every aspect of life. The wind here rarely rests. Waves crash endlessly against dark stone cliffs, and the horizon often disappears beneath rolling banks of mist that blur the boundary between water and sky. For the people who lived on these islands during the medieval centuries, the ocean was both provider and destroyer. It brought fish, trade, and connection to distant lands, but it could also bring storms, disease among livestock, ruined crops, and long seasons of hardship. In the quiet tradition of folklore preserved through stories for sleep, and remembered today through accounts of boring history for sleep, the islanders developed an explanation for the disasters that seemed to emerge from the sea. That explanation took the form of a creature so disturbing that many historians consider it one of the most unsettling beings in all of European mythology. It was called the Nuckelavee. Unlike many mythical creatures that blend animal and human features in strange but recognizable ways, the Nuckelavee was described as something profoundly unnatural. The creature emerged from the sea in the shape of a horse fused with a rider, yet the two bodies were joined together as if they had grown from the same flesh. What made the image especially horrifying was that the Nuclevi had no skin. Its muscles were exposed to the open air, red and glistening as if freshly torn from beneath the surface. Yellow veins stretched visibly across the creature's massive body, pulsing beneath the surface like twisted ropes. Atop the monstrous form sat a distorted rider whose head rolled heavily from side to side. In the center of its face burned a single enormous eye, and from its mouth poured a breath so poisonous that it was said to wither crops, sicken animals, and spread illness among entire villages. According to Orkney folklore, the Nuclevi lived beneath the sea and rose to the surface when angered. When storms destroyed fishing boats, the islanders sometimes whispered that the creature had been seen riding the waves. When cattle fell ill without explanation, people said the Nuclevi had breathed upon the land. Even droughts or strange changes in the water could be blamed on the skinless horseman. Yet, like many creatures that appear throughout folklore, the Nuclevi had one weakness: fresh water. It could not cross running streams or rivers, and this small detail offered a sliver of hope in an otherwise terrifying legend. Islanders believed that if the creature chased someone across the moors, the only escape was to reach a stream before it caught them. The flowing water formed an invisible barrier the sea-born monster could not pass. When we look at this story through the lens of medieval storytelling and mythology, the Nuclevi revealed something important about the psychology of isolated communities. Life on the Orkney Islands depended almost entirely on the sea and the fragile balance of nature. When that balance failed, when crops died or animals became sick, the consequences could be devastating. In such a world, it was natural for people to imagine that the source of disaster came from the same place that sustained them. The sea itself became a living force with moods and intentions, and the Nuclevi embodied its darker side. Over time, as scientific understanding of weather, marine ecosystems, and animal disease expanded, the terrifying horseman slowly retreated from everyday belief. Storms became meteorological events. Livestock illness could be studied and treated. Fishing failures were explained by shifting ocean patterns rather than supernatural anger. Yet the legend never vanished completely. Even today, the Nuclevi remains one of the most haunting figures in Scottish folklore, a reminder of how fragile life once felt for communities living at the mercy of the sea. And perhaps on certain nights in Orkney, when the wind howls across the cliffs and the waves pound against ancient rock, it is still possible to understand why people once imagined something monstrous rising from the water. As the sound of the ocean fades and our journey through the medieval world begins to draw to a close, the creatures we have encountered leave behind a quiet realization. The fears of the Dark Ages were shaped by plague, wilderness, isolation, and the unpredictable forces of nature. Yet history never stands still. As the centuries moved forward and the medieval world slowly transformed, new ideas began to emerge. Science grew alongside superstitions, and the creatures that appeared during this next era would reflect that strange coexistence. So allow the images of dark forests, silent riders, and skinless horsemen to soften now in the quiet rhythm of sleep, because the next chapter of our journey leads us to a different age entirely, an age where reason and myth walked side by side, and the monsters they created became stranger than ever before.
The medieval world slowly fades behind us now, like a distant lantern disappearing into mist, and we step into a strange and uncertain era where superstition and early science walked side by side. The year might be somewhere in the late 15th or 16th century, and Europe is changing in subtle but powerful ways. Scholars are rediscovering ancient texts, alchemists are experimenting with strange mixtures in candlelit laboratories, and physicians are beginning to question old beliefs about illness and the body.
Yet, despite these new ideas, the nights remain just as dark as they have always been, and the human mind, in darkness, has a habit of creating explanations for experiences it cannot understand. Among the many stories that drifted quietly through villages and cities during this time, there was one creature that seemed disturbingly personal, a visitor that did not lurk in forests or graveyards, but appeared in the most private place imaginable, the bedroom. In the quiet language of European folklore, preserved in countless sleep stories and whispered in the long tradition of history to fall asleep to, people spoke about a small demon that visited them in the deepest hours of the night. The Germans called it the Alp. Imagine the scene as it might have unfolded centuries ago. A wooden house sits beneath a silent sky, its windows dark except for the faint glow of dying embers in a hearth. A villager sleeps beneath heavy blankets, the air cool and still. Suddenly, the sleeper awakens, or at least the mind awakens. The eyes open, the room becomes visible in the faint moonlight, but something is terribly wrong. The body refuses to move. Arms and legs feel as though they are made of stone. The chest feels heavy, as if a weight has settled upon it, pressing down slowly, deliberately. Breathing becomes difficult. Panic rises. And somewhere in the dim shadows of the room, there is the overwhelming feeling that something is watching. Today, we know this experience by a clinical name, sleep paralysis. Modern neuroscience explains that during certain transitions between sleep and wakefulness, the brain awakens before the body's protective paralysis is faded. The result is a strange and frightening state in which the mind is conscious while the muscles remain locked. Hallucinations can occur, and the pressure on the chest is caused by the body's breathing muscles still operating under sleep mechanisms. But hundreds of years ago, no one understood these neurological details. They understood something far simpler and far more vivid. Something had entered the room. According to folklore across Germany and neighboring regions, the Alp was a small goblin-like creature that crept into houses during the night. It wore a magical cap called the Tarnkappe, a hat of invisibility that allowed it to slip unnoticed through doors and windows. Once inside, the Alp would climb onto the chest of a sleeping person and sit there quietly, feeding on the sleeper's breath and fear. Victims described the same sensations again and again across centuries. They could not move. They felt pressure on their chest. They sensed a hostile presence in the room. Some even claimed to see the creature itself, small, shadowy, crouched upon them like a living weight. The remarkable consistency of these reports fascinates modern scholars of folklore and sleep science alike. Across different cultures and centuries, people experiencing sleep paralysis often report nearly identical visions: a small being, a crushing weight on the chest, the inability to scream or move. It is as if the human brain, when caught in this peculiar state between dreams and waking life, produces the same image again and again. The Alp, then, was not merely a demon from mythology. It was the human mind attempting to explain a deeply unsettling neurological experience long before science offered a vocabulary for it. In the quiet storytelling traditions that survive today in history to fall asleep to, in gentle sleep stories shared across generations, the Alp reminds us how intimately connected our fears are to the workings of our own bodies. The demon did not live in distant mountains or forgotten tombs. It lived in the fragile boundary between dreaming and waking. Over time, as medical knowledge expanded and scientists began studying sleep in the brain, the need for the Alp slowly faded. Physicians could describe sleep paralysis in clinical terms. Hallucinations could be explained by neurological processes.
the mysterious visitor of the night, was no longer necessary as an explanation. Yet, even now, if you speak to someone who has experienced sleep paralysis for the first time, they will often describe it in language remarkably similar to those ancient accounts: a presence in the room, a weight on the chest, the feeling of being watched. And so the Alp remains, quietly embedded in the long memory of folklore, a reminder that even in an age of science, the human mind still carries echoes of older stories. Because when darkness falls and the world grows silent, the boundary between imagination and reality can feel very thin indeed.
As the quiet image of the Alp fades into the darkness of the sleeping mind, our journey gently shifts once again, moving away from the bedroom and out into the open air of another landscape shaped by centuries of folklore. This time, we travel west, across the Irish Sea, toward a land of rolling green hills, mist-covered roads, and ancient stone villages where stories have always flowed as naturally as wind across the fields. Ireland has long been a place where the boundaries between worlds feel thinner than usual. In countless sleep stories and traditions of history to fall asleep to, Irish folklore describes a universe where the living and the unseen are never entirely separated. Spirits wander quietly along country roads, fair folk dance in hidden valleys, and sometimes the future itself appears briefly before it happens. Among the strangest of these stories is the legend of the Fetch. The Fetch was not a monster in the traditional sense. It had no claws, no glowing eyes, no terrible roar echoing through the night. Instead, the Fetch looked exactly like you. It wore your clothes, moved with your gestures, and carried your face. Seeing one was not an attack, it was something far more unsettling. It was a message. In rural Irish belief, encountering your own double meant that death was near. Sometimes the person themselves would see the Fetch walking ahead of them on a lonely road. Sometimes neighbors claimed to see the figure passing by a house, even though the real person was somewhere else entirely. The details varied slightly from village to village, but the meaning was always the same. The appearance of the Fetch meant that the universe had already decided something. The person whose double had been seen would soon die. For modern listeners, the idea might sound like a simple ghost story, but within the cultural context of Irish folklore, it carried a much deeper psychological meaning. Life in rural Ireland for centuries was filled with uncertainty. Farming accidents, illness, childbirth complications, and sudden storms could claim lives without warning. Death was not distant or abstract, it was part of everyday reality. The Fetch transformed that randomness into something that felt structured, almost orderly. Instead of death arriving without explanation, the appearance of a double suggested that the universe was providing a warning. In a strange way, this belief offered a kind of emotional preparation. If someone heard that their Fetch had been seen, families sometimes began making arrangements. Priests might be called. Words left unsaid could finally be spoken. The approaching loss was acknowledged instead of denied. In this sense, the Fetch acted as a symbolic messenger between worlds. It did not harm anyone, it did not hunt or stalk the living, it simply appeared briefly, like a reflection stepping out of a mirror, reminding people that life was fragile and temporary. Scholars who study folklore and psychology often suggest that many Fetch sightings were likely the result of mistaken identity in poor lighting or moments of fatigue and stress. In villages where many people shared similar clothing and appearance, it would not have been difficult for someone to glimpse a familiar figure walking along a foggy road and assume they had seen someone else entirely. Yet even if some sightings were accidental, the cultural response to them reveals something fascinating about the Irish relationship with mortality.
Rather than reacting with panic or denial, the traditions surrounding the fetch often encouraged quiet acceptance. Life had its beginning and its ending, and the fetch was simply the shadow of that ending, appearing a little earlier than expected. In the soft rhythm of storytelling that defines many history to fall asleep to and peaceful sleep stories shared today, the fetch becomes less frightening and more reflective. It invites listeners to consider the strange experience of seeing oneself from the outside, as if life were a path already drawn and we were simply walking along it. The idea can feel unsettling at first, but it also carries a certain calm wisdom. Because if every life has a path, and every path eventually reaches its end, then perhaps the most meaningful thing we can do is walk that road with awareness while we can. Over time, as photography, mirrors, and scientific explanations of perception became common, belief in the fetch slowly faded. Doppelgangers moved from folklore into literature and psychology rather than everyday superstition. Yet the image of a double walking quietly along a misty Irish road remains one of the most haunting symbols in European folklore. It reminds us that between the worlds of life and death, there has always been a mysterious space where imagination tries to make sense of the unknown. And as our journey through this strange era between science and superstition continues, we leave the green hills of Ireland behind and turn our attention northward toward colder lands where the Old Norse imagination created creatures far more unsettling than a silent double on the road.
Leaving behind the mist-covered hills of Ireland where the silent double known as the Fetch walked lonely roads, our journey now turns northward toward a colder and more severe landscape, a place where the wind carries the scent of salt and pine across endless fjords and dark forests. Scandinavia during the late medieval and early modern periods was a region where the natural world felt immense and often unforgiving. Long winters stretched across months of darkness, the sun barely rising above the horizon, and villages were scattered far apart across rugged coastlines and thick forests. In such environments, the imagination naturally filled the unseen spaces with creatures drawn from ancient folklore, stories repeated beside fires during long nights and preserved today in the quiet tradition of sleep stories and history to fall asleep to. Among these strange beings, there existed one that was particularly unsettling because it lacked the one thing most creatures possess: a shape. It was known simply as the boneless. The boneless was described not as a monster with claws or teeth, but as something far more difficult for the mind to grasp, a shapeless presence that moved through darkness like living shadow. Some accounts from Scandinavian folklore described it as a mass of shifting flesh without bones, sliding along the ground with an unnatural, fluid motion. Others said it could flatten itself against walls or flow beneath doors, entering houses without sound. The absence of bones made it unpredictable and deeply disturbing because it seemed to defy the structure that defines living bodies. Imagine hearing a sound in the darkness of a wooden house during a northern winter night, a slow, dragging movement along the floorboards, followed by the uneasy feeling that something unseen has entered the room. The boneless was said to attack quietly, wrapping itself around victims and draining their strength, leaving them weak and trembling as though life itself had been slowly squeezed away. Yet what fascinates historians and scholars of folklore about the boneless is not merely the creature's appearance, but what it reveals about the fears of people living in northern climates centuries ago. Long winters meant long periods of isolation, illness, and physical weakness. Diseases that spread quietly through villages could leave victims exhausted, feverish, and unable to move properly.
In an age before modern medicine, such conditions could appear mysterious and terrifying. When someone grew pale and weak over time, when muscles lost strength and the body seemed to collapse inward, the experience may have felt like something invisible was draining life from within. The boneless, therefore, becomes less a literal monster and more a symbolic explanation for illnesses that slowly removed the strength from the human body. In folklore, it represented the quiet horror of losing control over one's own physical form, of feeling one's body become fragile and unreliable. The image of a creature without bones also carried a deeper psychological symbolism. Bones represent structure, stability, and the framework that allows the body to stand upright and move with purpose. A boneless creature suggests the absence of that structure, a being defined by instability and fluidity. For people living in harsh northern environments where survival required strength and endurance, the idea of losing that inner structure could be profoundly frightening. And yet, within the calm rhythm of storytelling that defines many sleep stories and traditions of history to fall asleep to, the boneless also reminds us how the human mind seeks patterns even in fear. When something unknown threatens us, imagination gives it form, even if that form is something as unsettling as shapeless flesh moving silently through darkness. Over time, as medicine advanced and understanding of disease improved, the boneless gradually faded from everyday belief. Illness could be diagnosed and treated rather than attributed to invisible creatures. But the story remains an intriguing reflection of how people once tried to understand weakness, sickness, and the mysterious loss of vitality that can affect any human life. As our journey through this era between science and superstition continues, the shapeless horror of the boneless slowly dissolves back into the shadows of northern folklore. Yet the Scandinavian imagination did not stop there, because in these same lands, another creature waited, one far older and far more solid than the boneless, a being that did not creep silently through houses, but rose from the graves themselves. And in the ancient Norse stories carried across generations, that creature had a name, spoken with equal parts fear and fascination: the Draugr. As the shapeless presence of the boneless dissolves quietly back into the shadows of northern folklore, our path through this strange era between superstition and early science leads us deeper into the cold landscapes of Scandinavia, where the sea is dark, the forests are ancient, and the past feels unusually close to the surface of the earth. In these lands, the boundary between the living and the dead was never considered permanent. The Vikings who once sailed these waters believed that death was not simply an ending, but a transformation, a passage into another state of existence. Their sagas, which survive today as some of the richest sources of northern folklore and history to fall asleep to, are filled with stories of warriors who refuse to remain peacefully in their graves. Among these figures, there is one creature whose presence feels far more solid and physical than the shadowy beings we have encountered so far. It was called the Draug. Unlike many ghosts in later European traditions, the Draug was not an invisible spirit drifting through walls or whispering in empty halls. The Draug kept its body. It rose from the grave with the same flesh that had been buried beneath the earth, though time had twisted that body into something far more frightening. According to Norse folklore, a Draug was usually someone who in life had been powerful, greedy, or fiercely attached to their possessions. Even in death, they refused to release their hold on the world. When night fell over lonely burial mounds scattered across the Scandinavian landscape, the Draug would awaken within its grave. The earth would stir, the mound would open, and the dead figure would climb back into the cold air of the living world. The sagas describe these revenants as enormous and terrifyingly strong, sometimes growing larger than a normal human as they walked. Their skin was said to be dark or bluish, swollen with the stillness of death, and their eyes burned with a dull, unnatural awareness. Unlike ghosts who merely haunted places, Draug could interact violently with the physical world. They guarded treasure buried with them, attacked travelers who passed too close to their burial mounds, and in some stories even entered nearby villages to spread fear and sickness. To modern readers listening to sleep stories or history to fall asleep to, these accounts might sound like early versions of the vampire legends that would appear centuries later across Europe. Yet the Draug was very different from those later creatures. It did not feed on blood, and it was not destroyed by sunlight. Instead, it represented a deeper fear rooted in Viking culture itself, the idea that the dead might refuse to accept their place in the natural order. Viking society placed enormous importance on honor, reputation, and legacy. A person's name and deeds were meant to survive long after their body was gone. But the Draug symbolized the darker side of that desire for permanence. It was the image of someone who clung so fiercely to the material world that even death could not loosen their grip. Their greed, anger, or unfinished ambitions chained them to the grave, transforming them into something neither fully alive nor peacefully dead. In the sagas, there are many stories of heroes confronting Draug in lonely burial mounds. These encounters were rarely easy. The Revenant often possessed supernatural strength and could crush or strangle opponents with terrifying power. Only through courage and determination could a living warrior defeat such a creature, sometimes by burning the body or sealing the grave with special rituals to prevent the dead from rising again. Yet beyond the dramatic battles described in those ancient stories, the Draug reveals something important about the fears and values of the society that imagined it. In a harsh environment where survival required cooperation and honor within the community, the idea of someone refusing to move on after death represented a dangerous disruption of balance. The Draug was not simply a monster, it was a warning about obsession and the inability to release control. Over time, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia and burial practices changed, belief in the Draug slowly faded. New religious frameworks offered clearer explanations for the afterlife, and the restless dead of the Viking sagas gradually retreated into legend. Yet even today, the image of the Draug remains one of the most vivid figures in northern folklore, a reminder that human beings have long struggled with the question of what it truly means to let go. And as our journey through this chapter continues, the cold burial mounds of Scandinavia slowly disappear behind us, because the next creature we encounter was not born in remote forests or ancient graves. It appeared in one of the largest cities in the world during the birth of modern society. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestone streets, newspapers spread stories faster than ever before, and yet somehow, in the middle of that modern city, a new monster began leaping through the night. His name was Spring-Heeled Jack.
As the cold burial mounds of Scandinavia fade quietly into the distance, our journey leaves the silent forests and frozen coastlines behind and enters a very different world, a place filled not with isolated villages or ancient graves, but with crowded streets, flickering lamps, and the restless energy of a rapidly changing society. It is the city of London in the year 1837, at the dawn of the Victorian era, a moment when the modern world was beginning to take shape. Gas lamps illuminated cobblestone roads for the first time, newspapers circulated stories at astonishing speed, and scientific discoveries were slowly transforming the way people understood nature. Yet, even in this city that prided itself on progress and rational thinking, something strange began moving through the night. In the long tradition of folklore preserved in history to fall asleep to and quiet sleep stories told across generations, London suddenly found itself haunted by a creature unlike anything that had come before. His name was Spring-Heeled Jack.
The first reports appeared in the late 1830s, and they spread through the city with astonishing speed. Witnesses described a tall, thin figure moving through the foggy streets and narrow alleyways of Victorian London. His clothing was unusual, tight-fitting and dark, sometimes described as resembling a strange uniform or costume that clung to his body. But what truly terrified those who encountered him were his eyes, which many witnesses insisted glowed like red fire in the darkness. Some claimed his hands ended in metal claws. Others said that when he spoke, his voice sounded hollow and mechanical. Yet, the most remarkable feature of Spring-Heeled Jack was not his appearance, but his movement. According to the reports, he could leap extraordinary distances. People claim to have seen him jump effortlessly over tall walls, across entire streets, and even onto rooftops. One frightened witness insisted that he had watched the figure leap over a carriage as though gravity itself had no power over him. Between 1837 and the 1870s, sightings were reported not only in London, but also in other English cities such as Liverpool and Sheffield. Newspapers eagerly printed every new account, and the mysterious figure quickly became a sensation. Panic spread through neighborhoods as people whispered about a supernatural attacker moving through the night. Several women reported being assaulted by a figure matching Jack's description, claiming that he breathed blue or white flames from his mouth before vanishing into the darkness. The fear became so widespread that the Lord Mayor of London launched an official inquiry in 1838, attempting to determine whether the mysterious jumper was a criminal, a prankster, or something far more unsettling. Vigilante groups formed, determined to capture the creature, but despite numerous searches and investigations, no one was ever conclusively identified as Spring-Heeled Jack. What makes this story so fascinating in the context of folklore is the moment in history in which it appeared. London during the Victorian era was one of the most technologically advanced cities on Earth. Railways were expanding across the country, gas lighting illuminated the streets, and newspapers allowed information to travel faster than ever before. In earlier centuries, strange creatures had been associated with remote forests, lonely mountains, or ancient burial grounds, but Spring-Heeled Jack appeared in the heart of modern civilization itself. Scholars who study folklore often point to this moment as an example of how new fears can emerge during times of rapid social change. When societies shift quickly from old traditions toward modern scientific thinking, there is often a strange gap between belief systems. The old explanations for the unknown begin to fade, but the new ones have not yet fully taken hold. In that uncertain space between worlds, the imagination becomes particularly active. Spring-Heeled Jack may have been a prankster, a criminal wearing a costume, or perhaps several different individuals whose actions blended together into one larger legend. Yet, regardless of the truth behind the sightings, the story reveals something deeply human about the era that created it. Victorian London was a city caught between past and future, between superstition and science, and in that unstable moment of transition, a monster was born, not an ancient myth, but in newspaper headlines, in whispered rumors spreading through gas-lit streets. Over time, as the century progressed and modern policing and journalism improved, sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack gradually faded. The mysterious leaping figure slipped quietly back into the realm of legend, leaving behind one of the strangest chapters in urban folklore. Yet, his story remains a powerful reminder that even in the most advanced societies, the human imagination never truly stops creating monsters. Because when the world changes quickly, when familiar explanations disappear and new ones are still forming, the space between certainty and mystery becomes fertile ground for stories that blur the boundary between reality and myth. And now, as the gas lamps of Victorian London dim and the echoes of hurried footsteps fade into the distance, our journey prepares to cross an ocean. The next creatures waiting in the pages of this strange history were not born in ancient Europe at all. They emerged in the vast wilderness of a young and expanding nation, a land of forests, mountains, and endless frontier, where fear traveled through rumor just as quickly as it once traveled through medieval villages. We are leaving the old world behind. Ahead lies America.
As the gas lamps of Victorian London fade into the distance, and the echoes of Spring-Heeled Jack disappear into the quiet fog of history, our journey crosses the Atlantic Ocean toward a different kind of landscape entirely. The old world, with its castles and ancient forests, gives way to the vast and restless wilderness of the New World. It is the early 20th century now, a time when America is transforming rapidly. Railroads carve their way across the continent, factories rise in growing cities, and technology begins reshaping everyday life. Yet even in this modernizing nation, there remain pockets of wilderness so deep and mysterious that they seem untouched by time itself. One of these places lies in southern New Jersey, hidden between major cities, yet strangely isolated. It is known as the Pine Barrens, a massive stretch of forest covering more than 1 million acres, filled with tangled pines, sandy soil, and winding streams that disappear into shadow. To walk through the Pine Barrens at night is to feel as though the world has grown quiet and ancient again. And for nearly 2 centuries, locals have whispered that something lives there. According to folklore preserved through calm history storytelling and strange accounts often shared in sleep documentary-style narratives, the legend begins in the year 1735 with a woman known as Mother Leeds. She was said to have been pregnant with her 13th child, already exhausted by poverty and hardship. In a moment of frustration and despair, she reportedly cried out that if she must have another child, then let this one be the devil. Legends say that when the baby was born, it appeared normal for only a few moments. Then its body twisted and changed. Wings unfurled from its back, hooves replaced its feet, and its head reshaped into something resembling that of a horse. The creature screamed, lashed out violently, and then fled the house by flying up the chimney before vanishing into the forests of the Pine Barrens. For generations afterward, the story remained little more than a regional legend. Families told it around fires during long winter nights. Travelers passing through the forests sometimes claimed to hear strange cries echoing between the trees, but the creature remained mostly part of local folklore. Then came January of 1909. During one extraordinary week, the legend exploded into something far larger than anyone expected. Reports flooded newspapers across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, describing sightings of a winged creature moving across towns and villages. More than 1,000 witnesses claimed to have seen the Jersey Devil. Tracks appeared in the snow, strange hoofprints that seemed to move across rooftops and even climb walls before abruptly disappearing. Schools closed out of fear. Factories sent workers home early. Armed groups formed and marched into the Pine Barrens hoping to hunt the creature down. The panic spread so quickly that the event became one of the most remarkable episodes of mass hysteria in American history. To modern historians studying boring history and social psychology, the question is not whether the Jersey Devil truly existed. The far more interesting question is why so many people suddenly believed that it did. The year 1909 was a moment of intense cultural change in the United States. Immigration was rapidly reshaping cities, industrialization was altering traditional ways of life, and rural communities often felt that the world they knew was disappearing. The Pine Barrens represented one of the last remnants of the untamed American wilderness in a region that was otherwise becoming suburban and industrialized. In this sense, the Jersey Devil may have symbolized something deeper than a monster in the woods. It represented the anxiety of a society caught between 2 eras. The forests that once felt endless were shrinking. The quiet frontier was vanishing beneath railroads and factories. And perhaps, for one strange week in 1909, the imagination of thousands of people gave the wilderness one final voice. The Jersey Devil did not simply frighten people. It reminded them that even in a modernizing world, there were still places where mystery could survive. Today, the Pine Barrens remain, though roads and towns surround them more closely than ever before. Occasionally, hikers still report hearing strange sounds echo through the trees at night. Most people smile at these stories now, recognizing them as echoes of folklore rather than evidence of a real creature. Yet the legend of the Jersey Devil continues to linger in American culture, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful monsters are not the ones that exist in the forest, but the ones created by collective imagination during moments of uncertainty. And as our journey through the New World continues, the dense forests of New Jersey slowly give way to even deeper wilderness farther north, where lumber camps once stood among trees so tall and thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. In those remote forests, another creature was said to wait patiently, always hidden just beyond sight, moving silently behind anyone who dared walk too far from the safety of camp. It was known by a name as unsettling as the forests themselves, the hide-behind.
Leaving the tangled forests of the Pine Barrens behind us, our path through the strange folklore of the American wilderness now travels deeper into the northern forests, where the land stretches for thousands of miles in every direction. During the 19th century, these forests were among the most remote places in North America. Vast pine and cedar trees formed a canopy so dense that sunlight sometimes reached the ground only for a brief moment around midday. Logging camps appeared in these remote regions as the expanding United States demanded lumber for cities, railroads, and ships. Men traveled hundreds of miles from home to work in these camps, living in rough wooden cabins surrounded by endless wilderness. Life there was harsh and often lonely. Weeks could pass without seeing anyone outside the small circle of workers in the camp, and the forest itself seemed alive with sounds that were difficult to identify. Branches cracked somewhere beyond sight. Wind moved through the trees in long, whispering currents. Animals passed silently through the darkness. In such an environment, the imagination had plenty of space to grow. It was within these logging camps that one of the strangest creatures in American folklore quietly appeared. The loggers called it the hide-behind. The name itself described the creature perfectly. According to the stories passed from camp to camp, the hide-behind had one remarkable ability. It could always remain hidden just behind whatever you were looking at. If you turned your head suddenly to see it, the creature moved faster than your eyes could follow, slipping instantly behind another tree or shadow. Some tales claimed it could flatten its body so thin that it could hide behind a single tree trunk no wider than a person's arm. Others said it moved with such speed and silence that no one had ever seen it directly. You could sense it. You could hear faint movements in the brush, but the moment you tried to look, there was nothing there. The hide-behind was blamed whenever a logger disappeared into the forest and failed to return. Logging in the 19th century was one of the most dangerous occupations in the world. Trees weighing several tons could fall unpredictably. Tools were crude and accidents were frequent. Exposure to cold, hunger, and wildlife all posed real dangers. And when a man vanished in a forest that stretched for hundreds of miles, finding a body could be nearly impossible. A person could disappear only a short distance from a trail and remain lost forever beneath the dense canopy of trees. Yet the human mind rarely accepts pure randomness when tragedy strikes. Within the storytelling traditions that now appear in calm history accounts and sleep documentary narratives, the hide-behind offered an explanation that felt strangely comforting compared to the cold uncertainty of the wilderness.
If a man vanished because of the hide-behind, then at least there was a reason. The forest had a creature in it, a presence that could be blamed, feared, and spoken about around the fire at night. Modern psychologists studying folklore often note that the feeling of being watched in a forest is remarkably common among human beings. Our ancestors spent millions of years as prey animals living among predators, and our brains remain wired to detect potential threats behind us. When walking alone through dense woods, especially at night, the human mind becomes hyper-aware of every sound and movement. That subtle anxiety can easily transform into the sensation that something unseen is following just out of sight. The hide-behind gave that ancient instinct a form. It turned a vague feeling into a story that could be shared. Loggers even joked that the creature hated alcohol, claiming that drinking heavily around the campfire might keep it away. Whether these stories were told in fear or humor probably depended on the night and the mood of the camp. Over time, as logging communities became less isolated and modern equipment improved safety in the forests, belief in the hide-behind gradually faded. Today, it survives mainly in collections of American folklore and in the quiet rhythm of boring history stories told to illustrate how people once interpreted the wilderness around them. Yet the legend still captures something essential about the relationship between humans and deep forests. Even now, when satellites map every corner of the planet, walking alone through a dense woodland at night can awaken the same ancient awareness that our ancestors once felt. The sense that something might be just behind you, moving silently between the trees. As the fires of those old logging camps dim and the northern forests fade into the background of our journey, we travel farther south into another wilderness entirely. A land of old mountains and deep valleys where the night carries a different sound. Not the whisper of trees behind you, but a distant cry echoing through the hills. A sound so strange that people who hear it often stop and listen in uneasy silence. Because somewhere in the Ozark Mountains, according to local stories, something still howls.
As the deep northern forests and the stories of the hide-behind fade into memory, our journey continues southward into a different wilderness entirely, a landscape older than many of the forests we have already visited. The Ozark Mountains stretch across parts of Missouri and Arkansas, rolling hills and deep valleys carved by time itself. These mountains are ancient, some of the oldest geological formations on the North American continent, worn smooth by millions of years of wind, rain, and shifting earth. Dense hardwood forests cover the slopes, while narrow hollows twist through the hills, where fog often lingers long after sunrise. It is a place where sounds travel strangely through the night, where echoes bounce between ridges and disappear into distant valleys. In the quiet rhythm of calm history storytelling and the reflective tone of many sleep documentary traditions, the Ozarks have long been known as a land where mystery lingers in the landscape itself. And among the stories whispered through these hills is the legend of a creature known as the Ozark Howler. Unlike many monsters we have encountered so far, the Ozark Howler is not described as aggressive or destructive. It does not stalk villages or spread disease. Instead, it exists in a far more subtle way, as a presence that belongs to the wilderness itself. Witnesses who claim to have encountered it often describe a creature roughly the size of a bear, covered in dark, shaggy fur that blends easily with the shadows of the forest. Some accounts say it possesses horns, sometimes curved like those of a goat, sometimes branching like the antlers of a stag. Others claim its eyes glow faintly in the darkness, reflecting the dim light of the moon filtering through the trees. Yet what truly defines the Ozark Howler is not its appearance, but its voice. The sound attributed to this creature is said to be unlike anything else in the forest, a haunting mixture of a wolf's howl and the piercing bugle of an elk.
Those who hear it often describe a cry that begins low and distant before rising into a strange, echoing call that rolls across the hills. It is the kind of sound that makes a person stop walking, listen carefully, and wonder what exactly might be moving through the darkness beyond the trees. Reports of the Ozark Howler have appeared sporadically over the last century and a half, usually from people traveling alone through the remote valleys of the Ozarks. Hunters, hikers, and farmers have occasionally described hearing the creature's cry late at night or catching a brief glimpse of a dark shape moving silently along a ridge. Yet unlike many creatures in folklore, the Ozark Howler rarely interacts directly with people. It does not attack, it does not pursue, and it does not seem to have any clear purpose beyond existing quietly within the wilderness. In this sense, the Ozark Howler represents an important shift in the evolution of monsters in folklore and storytelling traditions, such as boring history and calm history narratives. The earliest creatures we explored in this journey, from ancient demons to medieval revenants, were active threats. They killed, infected, or hunted human beings because those stories were born in times when the dangers surrounding human life were immediate and physical. Disease, starvation, and violence were constant realities. But the Ozark Howler emerges from a different kind of fear. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, human civilization had already begun to dominate much of the natural world. Cities expanded, railroads connected distant regions, and science provided explanations for many mysteries that once inspired supernatural stories. Yet the wilderness still remained in certain places, vast and quiet and difficult to fully understand. The Ozark Howler embodies that remaining uncertainty. It does not attack because the fear it represents is no longer about survival in the immediate sense. Instead, it reflects a more subtle modern anxiety, the awareness that there may still be things in the world we do not fully understand, a sound in the night that cannot be easily identified, a shadow that moves differently from the wind, a presence that reminds us that the natural world still holds secrets. Over time, as roads and towns spread deeper into the Ozark region, sightings of the howler became less frequent. Many modern explanations suggest that the mysterious cries attributed to the creature may simply be the combined echoes of wolves, coyotes, or elk moving through the hills. Yet even if the creature itself never existed, the story continues to echo through the folklore of the region, because the Ozark Howler represents the final stage in the long evolution of monsters. Ancient creatures attacked humanity directly. Later ones haunted villages and forests. But by the modern era, the monsters no longer needed to harm us. They simply waited quietly in the darkness, reminding us that the world is larger and more mysterious than we sometimes imagine. And now, as the hills of the Ozarks fall silent and the echoes of that distant howl fade into the night, our journey reaches the edge of a different kind of discovery. For 4,000 years, we have followed the stories of creatures that humanity feared and then gradually forgot. But the next chapter asks a deeper question, not about the monsters themselves, but about the minds that created them. Because to understand why monsters disappear, we must finally turn our attention away from the forests and the shadows and look at the human imagination itself.
As the distant echo of the Ozark Howler fades into the night, and the forests we traveled through slowly disappear into memory, our journey arrives at its final and perhaps most curious destination. For the last 2 hours, we have wandered through thousands of years of human history, meeting creatures that once terrified entire civilizations. These were not small campfire stories whispered for amusement. They were beliefs powerful enough to shape how people prayed, how they buried their dead, how they built their homes, and even how they slept at night. Parents whispered warnings about them to their children. Priests preached about them from sacred texts. Entire villages organized their lives around avoiding them. And yet today, most of these creatures are almost completely forgotten. Their names rarely appear in books.
Their stories survive only in fragments of folklore or obscure historical records, which leads to a strange question that historians, psychologists, and storytellers sometimes ask when studying mythology explained through the quiet lens of history for sleep. How does a monster die? Not the death of a physical creature that once walked the earth. Animals can go extinct through natural causes or environmental change, but a monster is something different. A monster is a belief. It is an explanation that human beings create when something in the world feels frightening and mysterious. For centuries, those explanations can feel as solid as any physical reality. People truly believed the Alps sat on their chest during the night. They believed the Noxer spread disease from its grave. They believed Apep fought the sun every evening beneath the horizon. When millions of people share the same belief, the creature it describes becomes very real in the cultural imagination. And yet, eventually, those beliefs fade. Not suddenly, and rarely with any clear moment when people collectively decide the creature no longer exists. Instead, the belief slowly dissolves, like fog disappearing under the rising warmth of daylight. The monster does not die in a battle, it simply becomes unnecessary. Historians studying folklore have noticed something remarkable when comparing creatures from different civilizations and time periods. When you look carefully at stories from Mesopotamia, medieval Europe, and the American frontier, patterns begin to appear. These patterns suggest that monsters disappear for very specific reasons. The fears that once sustained them change. The explanations that once made them convincing are replaced. And the world that allowed them to exist slowly transforms around them. In quiet documentary storytelling that invites listeners to learn history while you sleep, these patterns form a kind of map explaining how humanity gradually outgrows the creatures it once imagined. It turns out that monsters do not vanish randomly. They fade in predictable ways, almost like species evolving and disappearing through the long processes of cultural change. Over time, researchers have identified several repeating forces that consistently cause the death of monsters within human belief systems. The first of these forces is perhaps the most powerful of all, and it has appeared again and again throughout the stories we have explored tonight. It is something historians sometimes call the explanation upgrade. Every monster begins its life as an answer to a question. Why do people wake up unable to move during the night? Why do infants die suddenly? Why does disease spread from one household to another? Why does darkness swallow the sun at dusk? When a society lacks scientific tools or reliable information, the human mind fills the gap with stories. Those stories become creatures, spirits, demons, or ghosts. But eventually, new knowledge arrives. A new religion reshapes how people think about the afterlife. A medical discovery reveals how diseases travel. A neurological study explains why the brain sometimes wakes before the body. And when that new explanation appears, the old one quietly loses its power. The monster was never truly the point. The monster was simply the answer people once needed. As we continue exploring the quiet mystery of why monsters disappear from human memory, another pattern slowly emerges from the long timeline of history. If the first reason monsters die is that better explanations replace them, the second reason is even simpler and perhaps even more human. Sometimes monsters disappear because the danger that created them fades away. When we look carefully at the creatures we encountered earlier in this journey through mythology explained and calm historical storytelling, many of them were born directly from specific fears that people experienced every day. These were not abstract terrors. They were immediate threats that shaped the fragile reality of life in earlier centuries. Take, for example, the ancient demon Lamashtu, a terrifying figure blamed for the death of infants in the ancient Near East. In societies where infant mortality could reach devastating levels, where disease and malnutrition claimed countless young lives before their first year, parents desperately needed a way to understand such loss. The idea that a supernatural being might be responsible offered a strange form of comfort. If something had taken the child, then perhaps something else could protect the next one. Rituals, amulets, and prayers were created not only out of fear, but also out of hope. Over time, however, the world slowly changed. Improvements in sanitation, medicine, nutrition, and understanding of disease dramatically reduced infant mortality across many parts of the world. Children still fell ill, of course, but the mysterious and sudden losses that once haunted entire communities became less common. And as that danger declined, the emotional need for Lamashtu slowly faded as well. The creature did not vanish overnight. Its image lingered in ancient texts and archaeological discoveries. But in daily life, it gradually stopped being real. The same pattern appears in many other creatures throughout history. Consider the Nukkalevi of Scottish folklore, a horrifying horse-like being said to bring drought and disease to coastal communities. For fishing villages and agricultural societies whose survival depended entirely on unpredictable natural forces, a single season of failed crops or poisoned water could bring starvation. When storms destroyed boats or diseases spread through livestock, people searched for meaning in their suffering. The Nukkalevi provided that meaning. It turned random catastrophe into a story with a villain. But as technology advanced and agricultural science improved, as weather forecasting and modern farming practices reduced the unpredictability of harvests, the emotional power of that story began to weaken. When disasters became more explainable and sometimes even preventable, the creature that embodied them lost its purpose. In the quiet reflection encouraged by History for Sleep storytelling, this pattern reveals something deeply human about how we cope with fear. Monsters are rarely created from imagination alone. They emerge from the real conditions of human life. They represent the invisible forces that shape our survival: disease, famine, death, and uncertainty. When those forces are overwhelming and poorly understood, the mind constructs stories to give them form. A creature becomes a way of talking about danger, a symbolic language through which a community can process collective anxiety. But when the danger itself diminishes, the language gradually becomes unnecessary. The monster becomes a relic of an earlier world, a shadow left behind by fears that no longer dominate daily life. This does not mean that humanity has conquered all dangers, of course. New fears always emerge as societies change. But the creatures associated with those fears evolve along with them. The monsters that haunted ancient villages rarely survive in modern cities because the problems they once explained no longer feel immediate. In this way, every monster is connected to a particular moment in history. It belongs to a time when the world felt unpredictable in a specific way. And when that moment passes, the creature that once symbolized it quietly fades from memory. Yet there is another reason monsters sometimes disappear, a reason that has less to do with science or safety and more to do with the changing shape of the world itself. Because some creatures were not sustained by fear alone. They depended on the physical landscapes where mystery could survive. Forests, mountains, empty valleys where the unknown could hide just beyond the reach of human sight. And when those landscapes change, the creatures that lived within them must disappear as well.
As we continue our quiet reflection on why monsters disappear from human memory,
Another pattern slowly becomes visible when we look across centuries of folklore and belief. If some creatures fade because science replaces them, and others vanish when the dangers that created them disappear, a third reason is more subtle but just as powerful. Sometimes monsters die because the world around them changes. Not the intellectual world of ideas and explanations, but the physical landscapes where those creatures once seemed possible. Many of the beings we encountered earlier in this long journey through mythology, explained and calm historical storytelling, were inseparable from specific environments. Forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground, mountains where fog swallowed entire valleys, marshlands where strange sounds traveled through the night. In such places, the unknown could exist just beyond the limits of human vision. The imagination filled that darkness with creatures. The hide-behind, for example, belonged entirely to the deep forests of North America's logging frontier. Its very nature depended on trees standing close enough together for something to hide behind them. The creature existed because the forest was vast, unmapped, and frighteningly alive. When men walked between those towering pines, hearing branches crack somewhere behind them, the idea that something unseen might be following felt almost reasonable. Yet the forests that sustained that belief did not remain untouched. Over the late 19th and early 20th centuries, roads pushed deeper into wilderness. Railways carried people and machines across mountains, and vast areas of forest were cleared for farms, towns, and industry. The darkness that once hid mysteries began to recede beneath electric light and expanding settlements. When landscapes become familiar and mapped, the spaces where monsters can exist begin to shrink. A creature that lives only in the imagination of deep wilderness struggles to survive once that wilderness disappears. The same pattern can be seen in countless stories from around the world. Creatures of deserts, forests, or remote islands gradually fade as those regions become known, measured, and settled. Satellite imagery now reveals nearly every corner of the Earth's surface. Roads cross mountains that once took weeks to traverse. Even the oceans are mapped in astonishing detail. The modern world leaves fewer shadows where unknown creatures might hide. In the soft rhythm of history for sleep storytelling, this transformation reminds us that monsters often belong not only to a culture, but to a landscape. Change the land, and the creature loses its home. Yet there is an even more fragile reason monsters sometimes disappear, one that has little to do with science or geography. Some creatures die because the people who remembered them vanish. Throughout history, entire cultures have been transformed, displaced, or absorbed into larger societies. Languages disappear, traditions fade, and with them, the stories that once shaped those communities quietly dissolve. This is what historians sometimes call a collapse of cultural memory. It is perhaps the most tragic way a monster can die. When colonization reshaped entire regions of the world, countless indigenous belief systems were disrupted or erased. The creatures that lived within those stories were not simply replaced by new explanations or forgotten gradually. Instead, they vanished because there was no longer a community to tell the story, no elders to pass the legend to the next generation, no rituals to keep the memory alive. In many cases, the fears that created those creatures were deeply connected to the land and the experiences of that particular culture. Remove the people from that landscape, and the creature loses both its voice and its meaning. When historians today uncover fragments of those forgotten beliefs through archaeology or oral history research, it often feels like discovering the faint echo of an entire world that once existed.
A creature's name might survive in a single line of an old text or in a story remembered by only a few remaining storytellers. And yet within that fragile memory lies evidence of how human beings once understood their place in the universe. Monsters, after all, are not just imaginary threats. They are cultural expressions of fear, grief, and uncertainty. When the culture itself disappears, the monsters vanish with it, leaving behind only quiet traces for future generations to rediscover. As we look across these patterns together, a strange realization begins to emerge. Monsters do not simply die because people stop believing in them. They disappear because the world that needed them slowly changes shape. The explanations evolve, the dangers fade, the landscapes transform, and sometimes the cultures themselves are lost to history. Yet there is still one final pattern left to explore, one that belongs entirely to the modern world. Because in our time, monsters do not always vanish completely. Sometimes they survive in an unexpected form, no longer feared as real creatures, but reborn as something else entirely. Stories.
As we continue drifting through the quiet reflections of this final chapter, another pattern slowly emerges, one that feels particularly relevant to the world we inhabit today. Throughout our journey across thousands of years of folklore, one detail becomes increasingly clear when the timeline is viewed from a distance. The monsters of the ancient world lived far longer than the monsters of later centuries. The Giddim of Mesopotamia haunted human imagination for more than 1,000 years. Apep, the great serpent of Egyptian darkness, existed within the cultural mind of an entire civilization for millennia. Even many medieval creatures, such as the Nachtzer or the Dullahan, persisted across generations for centuries before gradually fading from everyday belief. But when we approach the creatures closer to our own era, something begins to change. The lifespan of monsters becomes shorter. The Jersey Devil surged into public awareness in the early 20th century, and within decades had already begun to fade into the background of folklore. The hide-behind existed primarily within a single generation of logging camps before the story lost its urgency. In the quiet cadence of history for sleep storytelling, this pattern reveals something profound about the speed of cultural change. Human societies today process information far more rapidly than any civilization in the past. In earlier centuries, stories moved slowly, carried by word of mouth, traveling only as fast as people themselves could walk, ride, or sail. A belief might remain stable for hundreds of years simply because new ideas took so long to arrive. But the modern world moves differently. Knowledge spreads instantly across continents. Scientific discoveries travel from laboratories to the public within months rather than centuries. The internet, global communication, and mass media accelerate the exchange of explanations about the world around us. When new answers appear more quickly, old explanations lose their power faster as well. Monsters that once required generations to disappear may now fade within decades, or sometimes within a single news cycle. In a sense, the modern world has shortened the natural lifespan of belief. The spaces where uncertainty can quietly grow have become smaller and more temporary. Yet there is another strange transformation that occurs in the modern age, one that does not simply erase monsters, but changes them into something new. Some creatures do not vanish entirely. Instead, they evolve. Vampires, for example, did not truly disappear when science replaced supernatural explanations for disease and death. Instead, they migrated into literature, film, and popular culture. Werewolves followed a similar path, shifting from feared supernatural threats into characters in stories, movies, and television. In these new forms, the creatures survive, but their role has changed dramatically. They no longer shape how communities behave or interpret danger. Instead, they entertain us. A monster that becomes entertainment undergoes a quiet transformation. It loses the power of fear that once sustained it. A creature that once haunted villages becomes a costume worn at festivals. A demon that once terrified children becomes a fictional character that audiences enjoy watching on a screen. In mythology explained through modern storytelling, this transformation is almost like a second life. The creature continues to exist, but its meaning has shifted from fear to fascination. Yet not all monsters receive this unusual afterlife. Many of the creatures we encountered during our journey tonight were too culturally specific or too deeply connected to a particular historical moment to survive as entertainment. The Alp, the Nachtseher, the Hide-Behind, and the Ozark Howler did not become global cultural icons. They remained tied to the societies that created them. And when those societies moved forward, the creatures simply faded. For a monster, this may be the most complete form of death imaginable. Not defeat, not transformation, simply forgetting. The story stops being told, and without the story, the creature has nowhere left to live. But before we close this journey completely, there is one final thought worth considering, a reflection that brings together everything we have explored tonight. Because when we look carefully at the creatures we have met across these centuries, a surprising realization begins to form. The monsters themselves may have changed names and shapes over time, but the human emotions that created them have never truly disappeared.
As our long journey through forgotten creatures finally reaches its quiet conclusion, there is one last thought worth lingering on before the night grows deeper and the stories begin to fade into sleep. Over the past 2 hours, we have traveled across thousands of years of human imagination, meeting beings that once terrified entire civilizations. The Giddim haunted the living with the fear that the dead had been neglected. Lamashtu embodied the unbearable grief of parents who lost children in a fragile world. Apep represented the ancient terror of darkness swallowing the sun. The Nachtseher mirrored the helpless confusion of plague spreading through medieval towns. The Dullahan transformed the inevitability of death into a figure that could be recognized and understood. The Alp reflected the strange moment when the human brain awakens before the body and creates nightmares from its own machinery. And the creatures of the New World, from the Jersey Devil to the Ozark Howler, echoed the loneliness of vast wilderness where the unknown seemed to breathe just beyond the edge of the firelight. Each of these monsters once felt completely real to the people who believed in them. Their presence shaped daily behavior, rituals, architecture, and the quiet fears that accompanied people through the night. And yet today, many of them survive only in fragments of folklore or in the pages of obscure historical records. The creatures themselves have faded, but the emotions that created them remain remarkably familiar. This is perhaps the most important realization in our exploration of mythology, explained through the calm perspective of history for sleep. Monsters are not random inventions. They are reflections. They are mirrors that reveal what a society fears most at a particular moment in time. When a civilization fears disease, its monsters spread sickness. When it fears darkness, its monsters live in shadows. When it fears the wilderness, its monsters wait in forests. In other words, every monster humanity has ever created has been built from human emotion, fear, grief,
Uncertainty and curiosity are the raw materials from which these creatures are shaped. When we say that monsters die, what we really mean is that the particular fears that once gave them life have changed form. The Giddim may have disappeared from our cultural imagination, but the human concern about honoring the dead still exists in rituals around the world. Lamashtu may no longer stalk ancient villages, but parents everywhere still worry about protecting their children from unseen dangers. Apep may not be blamed for the sunset anymore, yet the human fascination with cosmic darkness and the unknown universe remains powerful. In this way, monsters never truly vanish. They transform alongside the societies that imagine them. The forms change, the names evolve, but the underlying emotions remain remarkably constant across centuries. Even in our modern world, surrounded by scientific knowledge and illuminated cities, we continue to create new narratives to explain uncertainty. We worry about unseen forces that shape our lives, from invisible viruses to mysterious corners of the universe that science has yet to understand. The language may be different, but the instinct is the same. Humanity still tells stories to give shape to the unknown. And so perhaps the creatures we have met tonight are not truly gone. They have simply changed their costumes and stepped quietly into new stories. Yet there is something comforting in knowing that the monsters of the past have softened into myths and folklore rather than remaining living fears. The fact that we can now tell their stories calmly in the gentle rhythm of learn history while you sleep storytelling is evidence that the world has grown more understandable than it once was. The night is no longer filled with the same dangers our ancestors imagined in the darkness beyond their fires. Instead, the night can become something quieter, a space for reflection and rest. And so, as the last pages of this long exploration slowly closes, the creatures we encountered fade gently back into history, where they now belong. Their stories remain not as warnings, but as reminders of the long journey humanity has taken from fear toward understanding. Thank you for wandering through these ancient shadows with me tonight, sleepless traveler. Whether you listened to every word or drifted somewhere between Mesopotamia and the forests of America, I hope these stories gave your mind a peaceful place to wander. If they helped the quiet rhythm of history guide you toward rest, then they have served their purpose. The fire is fading now, the forest is still, and the long road through forgotten monsters comes to an end. Sleep well tonight. And if anything is watching over you in the darkness, perhaps it is not a creature at all, but simply the gentle and patient arrival of sleep.